What if I told you there's a clay tablet, 5,000 years old, that records kings who ruled for 36,000 years? Not in myth, not in legend, but in the same precise script the Sumerians used to count grain and measure the stars. And what if those impossible numbers aren't errors at all, but memories of a time when heaven and earth were one, and gods walked among men, and time itself flowed like a river we can no longer see? The Sumerian King List begins with 5 words that crack history open like an egg. When kingship descended from heaven. And what follows is a chronicle so strange, so mathematically precise, yet so utterly impossible by our standards, that scholars have spent a century trying to explain it away, calling it mythology, calling it exaggeration, calling it anything but what it claims to be: a record of the first rulers of Earth, beings who governed for tens of thousands of years before the flood swept over and the world began again. And here's what unsettles most. The Sumerians were not dreamers. They were engineers, the inventors of writing itself, masters of mathematics and astronomy, who calculated lunar cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched for millennia. And yet when it came to their own history, they wrote these numbers with the same calm certainty as they recorded harvests, as though nothing in those impossible spans was symbolic, as though they were simply stating fact. If you stay with me until the end of this journey, you will see something that history has never dared to tell, that perhaps civilization did not begin with us at all, but was given, handed down from those who came before the flood, those whose names are carved in clay, but whose presence lingers in every measurement we still use, every hour divided into 60 minutes, every circle drawn with 360 degrees. The fingerprints of a time when gods ruled not through force, but through knowledge. And the question that follows us through every chapter of this story is not whether you believe it, but whether you're ready to remember what your ancestors tried so desperately to preserve, pressed into mud and baked beneath the Mesopotamian sun, waiting 5,000 years for someone to lift it from the earth and read the words that whisper of divine descent and cosmic floods and the slow fading of eternity into human time. This is not a story about ancient kings. It's a story about us, about whether we can still hear the echo of that first descent, whether we can read the wedge marks in the clay and understand that they were never meant to convince us of anything, only to preserve a frequency, a vibration, the memory of a time when order was not imposed, but remembered. And what the Sumerian King List offers is not answers, but a pattern, a rhythm of rise and fall, of descent and flood and renewal that may still be playing out even now. And if you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever lamplight or screen glow falls across your face, I want you to leave a comment about your time zone or where you're sitting, because I want to know if the light where you are feels anything like the moonlight that once fell on these ancient ruins. If somewhere in the quiet of your own moment, you can sense what they sensed, that time is not as fixed as we pretend, that history is not a line, but a spiral, and we are simply another turn in its ancient coil. So let us drift into the quiet of that ancient plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates still murmur of gods and men, and listen to what remains when the noise of history fades into something older, something that whispers through the dust that once upon a time, before the world we know, there was another world. And it began like this: when kingship descended from heaven. Chapter 1. The tablet that cracked history open. You're standing in the ruins of Nippur, southern Iraq, and the heat presses against your skin like the breath of centuries, the dust swirling in lazy spirals across foundations that were ancient when Babylon was young. And somewhere beneath your feet, buried under layers of sand and broken brick, and the debris of empires that rose and fell like tides, lie the fragments of something that will change everything we think we know about the beginning. You kneel down, brushing sand from a piece of clay no larger than your hand, its surface covered with wedge-shaped marks pressed deep into the earth 4,000 years ago. And at first it looks like any other accounting tablet, the kind the Sumerians used to record grain stores and temple offerings. But then your eyes catch a line of text, and the numbers stop making sense. 28,800 years. And you blink and look again, thinking perhaps the heat has gotten to you. But the marks are clear and deliberate, each wedge placed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were writing. And beside that number is a name, Alulim, King of Eridu. And you realize with a cold shock that runs down your spine despite the desert heat, that this is not an accounting tablet at all. This is history, or something that claims to be history. And the claim it makes is impossible. But here's what makes your skin prickle, what makes you sit back on your heels in the dust and stare at this fragment of baked clay as though it were a message from another world. The Sumerians were not a primitive people. They were the most advanced civilization of their age, the inventors of the wheel, of writing, of mathematics complex enough to track the movements of planets and predict eclipses. They built cities with sophisticated drainage systems and temples aligned with mathematical precision to the stars. Their accountants could calculate compound interest, and their astronomers knew the length of the lunar month to within seconds. So when they pressed numbers into clay, they knew what they were doing. They were not guessing. They were not exaggerating for poetic effect. They were recording. And yet, here in your hands is a tablet that says a single king ruled for longer than all of human civilization as we know it. And the tablet does not apologize for this number, does not signal that it's metaphor or myth. It presents itself with the same bureaucratic calm as a tax record, as though nothing about it were strange at all. The first time scholars laid eyes on the Sumerian King List in the early 20th century, they were baffled. This was not what ancient history was supposed to look like. There were supposed to be myths, yes, creation stories and flood legends and tales of heroes, but those were understood to be separate from the actual historical records, the lists of kings and their deeds. Yet here was a document that seemed to blur that line entirely, that began with what could only be mythology, these impossibly long reigns, these divine rulers, and then, without any change in tone or style, transitioned smoothly into what appeared to be actual history. Kings whose reigns lasted decades rather than millennia, rulers whose tombs had been found, whose cities still stood in ruins across Mesopotamia. The tablet itself, or rather the many fragments and copies of it that have been found across dozens of archaeological sites, speaks in a voice of absolute certainty. It does not say these kings might have ruled, or, according to legend, they ruled. It simply states, in the matter-of-fact language of a bureaucrat, when kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. And then it names the king, Alulim, and gives his reign as 28,800 years. And then it moves to the next king, Al-Algar, who ruled for 36,000 years. And the pattern continues. City after city, king after king, each reign measured in thousands upon thousands of years, until suddenly, without warning, the text declares, then the flood swept over. Modern engineers study the King List with laser precision tools and walk away confused because the mathematics is too sophisticated to dismiss. The numbers follow patterns, multiples of 60, the sacred number of the Sumerians, the base of their entire mathematical system. The same system we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. And these are not random figures pulled from imagination. They are calculated, precise, following rules of harmony and proportion that suggest they meant something specific, encoded something real, even if we can no longer understand what that reality was. The King List exists in multiple copies, found in different cities, written in different periods, some dating to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, others copied 1,000 years later. Yet across all these versions, the essential sequence remains the same. The names of the antediluvian kings, their impossible reigns, the cities where kingship resided, even the total of years, 241,200 years from the descent of kingship to the flood. All of this is preserved with remarkable consistency, which tells us something important. This was not a casual invention, not a story that shifted with each telling, but something carefully maintained, copied with reverence, protected against the erosion of time and memory, as though the scribes who pressed these marks into clay understood that they were preserving something precious, something that had to survive. Some scholars have tried to explain it away by suggesting the Sumerians were confused about time, that perhaps their years were actually months or lunar cycles. And if you divide 28,800 by 12, you get 2,400, which is still impossibly long for a human life, but at least approaches the realm of exaggeration rather than fantasy. Yet this explanation falls apart when you consider that the same tablets that record these enormous reigns also record astronomical observations with perfect accuracy. They tracked Venus through its 8-year cycle. They knew the length of the lunar month to within a fraction of a second. They were not confused about time. If anything, they understood time better than we do. They saw it not as a straight line, but as a series of nested cycles, wheels within wheels, each turning at its own pace, but all connected to the great cosmic order. Another theory suggests these numbers are symbolic, that they represent not actual years, but something else, perhaps the authority of the king, his divine legitimacy measured in some abstract unit. And there's something to this, because the Sumerians did believe that power flowed from the gods, that kingship was not seized by force, but granted from above. Yet even symbolism has to mean something. And when you see that these enormous numbers follow precise mathematical patterns, that they're multiples of 60 and 600 and 3,600, you begin to suspect that the Sumerians were encoding information, using their sacred mathematics to preserve something they considered true, even if that truth was too large to fit into the categories we use to organize reality. And here's what changes everything. The Sumerian King List was not written by poets or priests drunk on mythology. It was maintained by the same scribal schools that taught accounting and law, the same institutions that kept meticulous records of grain stores and land ownership. These were bureaucrats. And bureaucrats do not tend toward wild flights of fancy in their official documents. They record what they're told to record, what their tradition tells them is true. And the tradition they inherited, the oldest layer of Mesopotamian memory, insisted that once upon a time, before the flood, kings ruled for thousands of years because time itself was different then, because the world was closer to the divine, because heaven and earth had not yet been separated by the catastrophe that would divide all of history into before and after. The text itself gives us a clue in its structure. Before the flood, The style is formulaic, almost hypnotic, city after city, king after king, each reign enumerated with the precision of ritual. But after the flood, something changes. The numbers shrink, yes, but more than that, the tone shifts, becomes more urgent, more fragmented, as though something in the transmission had been interrupted. As though the scribes who came after the flood were trying to remember something that had slipped just beyond the edge of memory. And perhaps that's exactly what happened. Perhaps the King List is not a record of events, but a record of forgetting. A document that charts the slow fade of divine time into human time, of eternity into history, of gods into men. The names themselves carry weight. Alulim, Al-Algar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Dumuzi the shepherd, each one a king of the world before the flood. And they ruled not from Babylon or Ur, but from older cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Sherupac. Places that were already ancient ruins when the first historical dynasties rose. And when archaeologists excavated these sites, they found what the King List claimed they would find. Layer upon layer of settlement, reaching back into the mists of prehistory. Temples built and rebuilt on the same spot across thousands of years, as though each generation was trying to maintain connection with something that had been there first, something holy. At Eridu, the city where kingship first descended according to the list, excavators discovered the foundations of at least 17 temples, each built directly atop the ruins of the one before. And the earliest of these, dating to around 5,400 years before the Common Era, was little more than a shrine of mud and reeds. Yet already it stood on the same plan, faced the same direction, occupied the same sacred ground as all the temples that would follow. As though the location itself were the point, as though there was something about that particular spot, that intersection of earth and water where the Euphrates met the marshes, that made it a door between worlds, a place where heaven could touch the ground. You try to imagine the scribes who first wrote these names, sitting in the temple school at Nippur or Ur, copying from older tablets that were already ancient in their time. Tablets that may have recorded traditions passed down orally for centuries before anyone thought to write them down. And you wonder what they felt as they pressed these impossible numbers into wet clay. Did they believe them literally? Did they pause and question whether any being could truly rule for 36,000 years? Or had the tradition become so sacred that to doubt it would have been unthinkable? To alter even a single figure, an act of sacrilege. And perhaps that's why the numbers survived unchanged across so many copies and so many centuries. Not because they were true in any sense we would recognize, but because they were holy. Because they carried the memory of a time that could not be allowed to die, even if it could no longer be fully understood. And so the scribes copied faithfully, preserving not facts, but the shape of a lost world, the outline of something vast that had once been, and might one day be again. Maybe the Sumerians understood something we've forgotten about the relationship between time and consciousness. That what we call a year is not a fixed unit of cosmic measurement, but a human construction, a way of marking the revolution of seasons that has meaning only from our particular perspective, hurtling through space on this small planet. And that from a different perspective, a different state of being, time might feel entirely different, might stretch or compress, might flow like water rather than march like soldiers. And if that's true, then perhaps what the King List is really recording is not the actual duration of these reigns, but the quality of them. These were ages of such perfect harmony, such complete alignment with the cosmic order, that they seemed to last forever, because they existed partially outside of time as we experience it, in a state closer to eternity than to history. The kings who ruled for 36,000 years were not simply very old men, but beings who had not yet fallen fully into the stream of temporal existence, who stood with one foot in heaven and one on earth, who embodied the principle of kingship in its pure form, before it became merely political power. And when the flood came, it was not just water that swept over the world, but time itself. Chronological time, historical time, the kind that ages and erodes and eventually reduces everything to dust. And after the flood, the kings who ruled were mortal, their reigns measured in decades, because they had lost that connection to the eternal. They were fully earthbound now, fully temporal. And the King List records this fall not as tragedy, but as transformation, not as punishment, but as the price of a new kind of consciousness. The awareness of history, of before and after, of self and other, of the separation between heaven and earth. What if the true message of the King List is not about the past at all, but about time itself, about the way our experience of duration depends on our state of consciousness, about the possibility that there was once a way of being in the world that made time feel different, slower, vaster, more like the experience of dreams, where a single night can contain what feels like years, and that this way of being was lost in the catastrophe we remember as the flood. But here's the question that follows you as you set down the tablet and brush the dust from your hands. If time contracted once, if the divine withdrew and left us with these short, brutal decades, these fleeting lives, could it expand again? Could kingship descend once more? And if it did, would we even recognize it? Or have we forgotten the language in which heaven speaks? Are you beginning to feel it? That slight tremor beneath what we call history. That sense that the ground we stand on is not as solid as we thought. That beneath the rational explanations and the scholarly dismissals, there's something older stirring. Something that the Sumerians knew, and we've forgotten. And perhaps that's why their words still have power after 5,000 years. Not because they convince us of anything, but because they remind us that we don't know as much as we think we do. That the past is stranger than the textbooks admit. That time itself might be more flexible, more mysterious than the ticking of clocks would suggest. The numbers in the King List don't ask for your belief. They simply exist, pressed into clay with the same confidence as any other historical record. And that confidence is what unsettles, because it suggests that the Sumerians were not making this up. They were reporting something, preserving something. And whatever that something was, it was important enough to copy and recount and protect across millennia of cultural change and political upheaval. But here's what comes next. And this is where the story takes a turn that will make everything we've discussed so far seem almost reasonable by comparison. Because we're about to encounter a single line carved into clay that marks the greatest mystery of all. A boundary, not just between ages, but between worlds. And on one side of that boundary are gods who ruled for tens of thousands of years. And on the other side is us. And the line itself, the moment of separation, is marked by 3 words that have echoed through every mythology and every flood legend in human history. And the Sumerians, with their characteristic precision, dated it, measured it, placed it in the sequence of events as carefully as they placed everything else. And what they recorded was this. Then the flood swept over, and after that line, nothing was ever the same again. Not time, not kingship, not the relationship between heaven and earth. And if we want to understand what the King List is really telling us, we have to understand what happened in that moment when the waters rose and the old world drowned. So let us descend now into that catastrophe. Let us stand at the edge of the deluge and watch as everything changes, as the gods withdraw, and humanity is left to begin again from the mud and the memory of what was lost. Chapter 2. When the Heavens Opened. You are standing at the excavation site of Sherupac, the last city to hold kingship before the flood, and beneath your feet lies something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about ancient Mesopotamia. A layer of clean riverine clay, nearly 8 feet thick, sterile and silent, separating 2 distinct strata of human civilization, like a scar dividing one life from another. You kneel down and run your fingers through the sediment, feeling its strange smoothness, its utter absence of the artifacts and debris that characterize every other layer of the tell. No pottery shards, no tool fragments, no animal bones, no charcoal from cooking fires. Just this band of pure alluvial deposit, laid down by water moving with such force and volume that it scoured everything away. And above it and below it are the unmistakable signs of human habitation, buildings and streets, and the accumulated trash of daily life. But here, in between, is nothing. A pause in history. A breath held between 2 worlds. The archaeologists who first discovered this layer in the 1920s thought they had found proof of the biblical flood, evidence that the story of Noah was not myth, but memory, and they radioed back to their universities with barely contained excitement that history and scripture had aligned. But as more sites were excavated across southern Mesopotamia, the picture grew more complex, because the flood layers appeared at different depths in different cities, suggesting not one catastrophic deluge, but a series of major flooding events spread across centuries. Yet the cultural memory seems to have compressed these separate disasters into a single mythic moment: the flood, the great dividing line that marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. But here's what makes your skin prickle as you sit in the dust examining this sterile clay. The Sumerian King List places the flood at exactly this point in the sequence, after the reign of Ubarra-Tutu, king of Sherupac, the son of whom was Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, the man who built the boat and survived the deluge and became the link between the world that was and the world that would be. And when you check the archaeological dates, they align with disturbing precision to around 2,900 years before the Common Era, the exact period when the early dynastic era was beginning in Sumer, when writing was transitioning from simple accounting marks to full literary expression, when the first true cities were rising from the marshlands. And it's as though the flood, whether literal or symbolic or some combination of both, marked not just a climactic event, but a psychological transformation, a break in consciousness that separated the mythic past from historical time. And after this line in the clay and in the text, everything changes. The kings who follow have mortal lifespans, their reigns measured in years you could count on your fingers, rather than millennia that stretch beyond comprehension, as if divine time had contracted in that moment when the waters rose, as if the thread connecting heaven to earth had been cut by the flood and could never be fully restored. The text itself treats the flood with strange brevity. After pages of careful enumeration, city after city, and king after king with their impossible reigns all precisely recorded, suddenly there appears a line of stark simplicity. Then the flood swept over, and that's it. No description of the rising waters, no account of divine wrath or human wickedness, no theological explanation for why it happened, just this flat statement of fact, as though the scribes understood that what occurred was too immense for elaboration, that some events are so total in their erasure that to describe them is to diminish them. And so they left it as simple record. The flood came, the world ended. And then, after a pause that you can almost feel in the spacing of the wedge marks, the text continues. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish, and with those words a new age begins. But it is not the same age. Something fundamental has shifted. The kings who ruled from Kish and the cities that followed, their reigns are numbered in hundreds of years at first, still superhuman, but approaching the realm of exaggeration rather than impossibility. And with each successive dynasty, the numbers continue to shrink. 600 years becomes 400, becomes 200. Becomes the recognizably human spans of decades, as if we're watching in real time, through the mathematics of the text, the fading of whatever made those first ages different. The slow draining away of divine time into historical time. What's remarkable is that this pattern of before and after, of impossible ages followed by mortal ones, of a catastrophic flood marking the boundary, appears not just in Sumerian sources, but across the ancient world. The biblical patriarchs lived for centuries before the flood of Noah. Adam lived 930 years, Methuselah 969. But after the deluge, the lifespans rapidly decrease until they settle into the familiar span of human life. And in Egyptian mythology, there is Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled directly over the earth, followed by dynasties of demigods, and then, finally, mortal pharaohs. And the transition between these eras is marked by chaos and destruction, by the waters of noon rising to swallow the old order. And in Greek myth, there is the succession of ages, the golden age, when men lived like gods without sorrow or toil, followed by silver and bronze and iron, each age shorter and harder than the last, each one further from the divine. And always, the transition is marked by catastrophe, by floods sent by Zeus, by the earth opening to swallow the wicked, by the gods withdrawing, step by step, until they become distant voices speaking through oracles, rather than walking among men as they once did. The geological record preserves its own memory of catastrophe. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, as the last ice age ended, the massive glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt, and the volume of water released was staggering. Sea levels rose by more than 400 feet over the course of several millennia, drowning coastlines and river valleys, transforming the geography of the entire world. And the process was not gradual, but punctuated by sudden, catastrophic pulses when ice dams failed, and released the pent-up waters of glacial lakes in torrents that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone in their path. In Mesopotamia, the effect would have been particularly dramatic, because the Persian Gulf at that time extended much further inland than it does now, and the Tigris and Euphrates flowed through a broad, fertile plain that is now underwater. And as sea levels rose, this plain would have been gradually inundated, pushing populations upstream, destroying settlements, erasing the landscape that had been home to perhaps thousands of years of human culture. And if there were cities on that drowned plain, and there's no reason to think there weren't, then they are gone now, buried under hundreds of feet of sediment at the bottom of the Gulf, and the memory of them survives only in myth, in stories of a time before the flood, when the world was different, when the gods were closer, when time itself flowed differently, because humanity had not yet been fully separated from the source. But the flood layers found at Mesopotamian sites date to much later, to around 2900 before the Common Era, and these represent not the gradual inundation of the post-glacial period, but specific catastrophic flooding events, possibly caused by a combination of unusual rainfall, snowmelt in the mountains of Anatolia and Zagros, where the rivers have their source, and the particular hydrology of southern Mesopotamia, where the land is so flat that water spreads out rather than draining away, creating shallow seas that can persist for months or even years. There is evidence that such floods occurred repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian history. The rivers were both blessing and curse, bringing the silt that made the land fertile, but also the waters that could destroy everything built upon it. And the Sumerians developed sophisticated systems of canals and levees to control the flow. But every few generations, the rivers would overwhelm these defenses, and the cities would drown. And each time this happened, it must have seemed like a return to chaos, like the primordial waters of the ABZU rising up to reclaim the ordered world. And perhaps that's why the memory of these floods was so profound. Not because any single one of them was uniquely destructive, but because they kept happening. Kept reminding the Mesopotamians that their civilization existed in tension with forces far greater than themselves, that order was temporary and chaos patient, and the waters always waiting. The question is whether these historical floods, traumatic as they were, can fully account for the mythic weight the King List gives to the flood, for the sense that something more than cities was destroyed, that the flood marked not just a political transition, but a metaphysical one. And here we might consider that the flood in the text functions on multiple levels simultaneously. It is both literal event and symbolic transformation, both historical catastrophe and psychological break. It represents the moment when humanity lost its direct connection to the divine, when the gods withdrew, not because they were destroyed, but because something in the cosmic order shifted, some harmony broke, some frequency changed. And after that break, the world that returned from the waters was not the same world that had gone under. It looked the same, perhaps, the same rivers and mountains and stars. But the quality of time had changed. The texture of existence had become denser, heavier, more opaque. And those who survived carried the memory of what had been lost, even if they could not quite articulate what that was. The King List itself gives us a clue in how it structures the narrative after the flood, because it doesn't say that kingship ended, it says that kingship descended from heaven again, the same phrase used at the beginning, as though what happened was not the end of divine rule, but its renewal, yet in diminished form, like a signal that has traveled too far and arrives weakened, still recognizable, but lacking the clarity and power it once had. Before the flood, kingship came down complete and stayed. Kings ruled for ages without succession, without challenge. The harmony was perfect, and unbroken. But after the flood, kingship becomes something that must be constantly renewed. It moves from city to city, from dynasty to dynasty. It is contested and overthrown and reclaimed. It becomes political rather than cosmic. And this suggests that the flood represents not punishment for human sin, though later traditions will read it that way, but the inevitable result of a world falling out of alignment, of the channel between heaven and earth becoming obstructed. And once obstructed, it could never be fully cleared again. The best that could be achieved was these brief moments of reconnection, these kings who ruled for a few hundred years rather than thousands, who tried through their reigns to re-establish the old harmony, but could never quite reach it, could never quite remember what it had felt like to exist in that state of grace. You stand there in the ruins of Sherupac with the sterile flood clay under your hands, and you try to imagine what it must have been like for the survivors, emerging from whatever shelter had protected them, to find their world transformed. The cities they had known reduced to mud, the fields buried under silt, the canals broken, the temples collapsed, and beyond the physical destruction, the psychological impact of having watched everything they trusted to be permanent simply wash away. And perhaps in that moment of absolute loss, something crystallized, a new kind of awareness, an understanding that everything is temporary, that order is not given, but must be constantly maintained, that the gods, if they exist, are not our protectors, but forces we must learn to live with. And this awareness, this exile from the innocence of the Golden Age, this is what the King List is really recording when it says, "The flood swept over." Not just the rising of waters, but the birth of historical consciousness, the knowledge of before and after, the awareness of time, not as eternal presence, but as linear progression, carrying everything toward dust. Maybe the flood was not a punishment, but a mercy. Not the end of something precious, but the beginning of something necessary. Because there is a strange liberation in understanding that nothing lasts forever, that even divine kingdoms fall, that the flood will come again in one form or another, because that's the nature of existence. Cycles of creation and destruction, of order emerging from chaos and dissolving back into it. And what the Sumerians learned, what they encoded in their king list for all subsequent civilizations to inherit, is that this cycle is not something to resist, but something to accept, to work with, to build into the very structure of society, so that when the flood comes, and it always comes, the memory survives, preserved in clay tablets and temple foundations, and the stories passed from one generation to the next. The question the King List poses is not, why did the gods withdraw? But what do we do now that they have? How do we maintain order in a world where divine kingship is memory rather than presence, where time moves forward irreversibly rather than cycling eternally, where we are alone with our mortality, and must find meaning in these brief spans, rather than in ages that stretch beyond comprehension? And perhaps the answer the Sumerians discovered, the wisdom they pressed into clay, is that meaning comes not from duration, but from remembrance, not from escaping the flood, but from rebuilding after it, not from recovering the Golden Age, but from honoring its memory, while accepting that we live now in the age of iron, and that this age too has its own kind of grace, its own form of kingship, its own way of touching heaven, even if heaven no longer reaches down to touch us. The pattern is emerging now, isn't it? You can feel the shape of it. even if you can't quite see all the details yet. The sense that the King List is describing something that happened not just to the Sumerians, but to all of humanity. Or perhaps to consciousness itself. A transformation so profound that it echoes through every mythology, every tradition, every culture's memory of paradise lost and golden ages fallen. And what makes it more than myth is the precision with which it's recorded, the mathematical patterns underlying the impossible numbers, the archaeological evidence of actual floods dividing the strata of ancient cities, the consistency of the tradition across thousands of years, as though the Sumerians were trying to preserve not just a story, but a frequency, a vibration, a way of remembering something that couldn't be fully spoken in the language of their time or ours. Because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about how civilizations develop, about where knowledge comes from, about whether the ancients were primitive people stumbling toward enlightenment, or whether they were trying to remember something that had been lost, trying to decode a message left by those who came before the flood. And the key to that message is hidden in the numbers themselves, in the mathematics of those impossible rains. And when you see the pattern, when you understand what the Sumerians were actually recording, you'll realize that we're not just reading history. We're reading a map, a set of coordinates, an instruction manual for reconnecting heaven and earth. And the first step is understanding that those 36,000-year rains are not exaggerations at all. They're frequencies, they're harmonics. They're the arithmetic of the divine. And we're about to decode them. So let us turn now to the numbers themselves, to the sacred mathematics that the Sumerians used to measure eternity, and discover what they were really counting. Chapter 3. The Arithmetic of the Divine. You're sitting at a table in the quiet of late evening with the King List spread before you. Not the actual clay tablet, but a translation. Columns of names and numbers that at first seemed random, but now as you write them down on paper, as you let your hand trace the sequence, something begins to emerge that makes your pulse quicken and your breath catch. Because you're seeing a pattern that shouldn't be there. A mathematical precision hidden inside what everyone dismissed as mythology. 28,800 years, you write. And beneath it, 36,000. And then you pause, because something about these numbers feels familiar. Not from history class, but from somewhere deeper. From the way time itself is structured. And you divide 28,800 by 60, and get 480. And you divide that by 60 again, and get 8. And suddenly you understand. These aren't random numbers at all. They're multiples. Perfect, harmonious multiples of 60. The sacred number of the Sumerians, the base of their entire mathematical system. The number that still governs how we measure time and space, thousands of years after Sumer fell to dust. You check the other reigns. Al-Algar's, 36,000 years. That's 600 times 60. Enmenluana's 43,200 years. That's 720 times 60. Every single one of them, all 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Their reigns are not arbitrary spans, but calculated intervals. Each one a multiple of 60, or 360, or 3,600. And these aren't just any multiples. They follow the same mathematical principles the Sumerians used to track the movements of planets, to calculate the length of the great year, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. A number the Sumerians somehow knew about 4,000 years before modern astronomy rediscovered it. And here's what makes your hands shake slightly as you write. What makes you feel like you've stumbled onto something that was deliberately hidden in plain sight. The total span of years from the descent of kingship to the flood is 241,200 years. And when you factor that number, when you break it down into its components, you find that it equals exactly 600 times 402, or alternatively, 3,600 times 67. Or most tellingly, 200 times 1,206. And 1,206 is not random. It appears again and again in Mesopotamian astronomy and mathematics as a key harmonic, a frequency that somehow meant something to them that we've forgotten. And you begin to suspect that what you're looking at is not history in any conventional sense, but something closer to music, a mathematical composition where each reign is a note, and the total is a chord. And what that chord represents, what it was meant to invoke, or preserve, or transmit, that's the mystery. But the fact that it exists, that these supposedly mythological numbers follow precise mathematical laws, that tells you something important. The Sumerians weren't making this up. They were calculating it. And if they were calculating it, then they were measuring something. And the question is what? What were they measuring with such precision that they encoded it in the reigns of gods? The number 60 is not arbitrary. It was chosen by the Sumerians because of its unique mathematical properties. It's the smallest number divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, which makes it perfect for a civilization that needed to divide things, to calculate fractions, to measure time and space, and grain and silver. And once they established 60 as their base, everything else followed. The hour with 60 minutes, the minute with 60 seconds, the circle with 360 degrees. These are not natural units. There's nothing in the physical world that demands we divide time this way. We inherited it from the Sumerians. And we inherited it because it works. Because 60 is mathematically elegant. Because calculations that would be cumbersome in base 10 flow smoothly in base 60. But there's something else about 60 that goes beyond practical calculation. In Sumerian theology, 60 was the number of Anu, the sky god, the supreme deity whose name literally meant heaven. And he was assigned this number not arbitrarily, but because of what it represented: totality, completion, the number that contains all other numbers. And when you multiply by 60, you're not just calculating, you're ascending, moving up through levels of magnitude toward something infinite. And this is what the King List is doing with its impossible reigns. It's using the arithmetic of 60 to describe something that can't be described in ordinary human terms. Durations so vast, they approach the eternal. States of being so perfect, they seem to exist outside of time as we know it. Consider what it means to say a king ruled for 36,000 years. That's 600 times 60, or 10 times 6 times 6 times 60. And in Sumerian numerology, 10 represented completion, 6 represented the cosmic order, the number of creation, and 60 was the divine. So, 36,000 becomes a way of saying this reign embodied 10 complete cycles of cosmic order, united with the divine. It's not trying to tell you how long the king lived. It's trying to tell you what kind of reign it was, what quality of harmony existed between heaven and earth during that period. And the fact that we can no longer think this way, that we've lost the ability to read numbers as anything other than quantities, That's part of what the flood washed away. The understanding that mathematics is not just measurement, but meaning. That numbers are not just symbols, but frequencies. And when you arrange them correctly, you're not describing reality, you're invoking it, calling it into being through the sacred architecture of calculation. The Sumerians built their temples according to these same principles. Every dimension a harmonic of 60. Every angle calculated to align with celestial movements. And they didn't do this to impress their gods, but to tune themselves to the cosmic frequency, to create spaces where the divine could descend, because the mathematics were correct, where heaven and earth could meet, because the geometry allowed it. And the King List is the same kind of structure, built not from brick, but from numbers, not in space, but in time. A temple of mathematics designed to preserve the frequency of that original descent, when kingship first came down from heaven, and the world was briefly perfect. Some researchers looking at these numbers have proposed something radical, that what the Sumerians were recording was not human lifespans, but astronomical cycles, and specifically the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the point where the sun rises on the spring equinox to shift gradually backward through the zodiac, taking 72 years to move 1 degree, 2,160 years to move through one constellation, 25,920 years to complete the full circle. And here's what's startling. The Sumerians knew about precession. Their astronomical texts track it. Their temples were realigned over centuries to account for it. But according to modern history, they shouldn't have known about it, because precession takes decades of careful observation to detect. You have to track the stars over generations and notice that they're slowly shifting. And yet the evidence suggests the Sumerians understood it from the very beginning of their civilization, as though they inherited this knowledge from whoever came before, from the culture that existed before the flood. And when you look at the numbers in the King List through this lens, when you see them as markers of processional ages rather than human lifespans, something remarkable happens. They start to make sense, not as literal durations, but as encoded astronomical information. Ways of preserving knowledge about the great cosmic cycles, about the relationship between earthly time and celestial time, about how what happens in the heavens is reflected on earth and vice versa. As above, so below. The Hermetic principle that appears in every ancient wisdom tradition. And perhaps this is what the King List is really preserving. Not history in the modern sense, but cosmic history. The story of how human consciousness evolved in relationship to the slow turning of the heavens. But here's where it gets even stranger, where the numbers start to reveal something that challenges everything we think we know about ancient civilizations. Because if you take the total span of 241,200 years and divide it by the precessional cycle of 25,920 years, you get approximately 9.3. which is close enough to 9 that you start to wonder if the Sumerians were describing 9 complete precessional cycles. 9 great years. 9 ages of the world, each lasting the full journey of the equinox around the zodiac. And if that's true, then the King List is not describing what happened in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. It's describing something vastly older, a span of time that reaches back into the last ice age and beyond, into a period when, according to conventional archaeology, there were no civilizations at all, just small bands of hunter-gatherers scratching out survival. Yet the mathematics in the King List suggests otherwise, suggests that there was something before, some culture or consciousness that understood precession, that built its conception of kingship around astronomical cycles. that saw time not as linear progression, but as eternal return, wheel within wheel within wheel, and that what the Sumerians preserved was the memory of this older understanding, encoded in numbers. Because numbers, unlike languages, can survive translation, can carry meaning across cultural boundaries, can wait millennia for someone who knows how to read them. What if the 36,000-year reigns are not exaggerations at all, but compressions, ways of encoding multiple processional cycles into a single figure? So that when you read Al-Algar ruled for 36,000 years, what you're really reading is, during the age associated with this king archetype, the equinox moved through 1.4 complete cycles, which would correlate to specific celestial configurations, specific relationships between Earth and stars, specific frequencies of cosmic energy that influenced consciousness in ways we can no longer detect because we've lost the sensitivity. We've narrowed our awareness to such a thin band of the possible that we can't even imagine what the ancients were describing. And so, we call it myth and dismiss it, and lose the very knowledge we most need. The understanding that consciousness is not fixed, that the way we experience reality depends on our alignment with forces larger than ourselves, that what we call history is just the surface ripples of much deeper currents. And the King List is a map of those currents, a guide to navigating time not as duration, but as frequency. And if we could learn to read it properly, we might discover that the gods who ruled for thousands of years are not behind us, but ahead of us, not in the past, but in the future, waiting for the cycle to complete and consciousness to ascend once more. To the Sumerians, this mathematical precision was not abstract. It had direct implications for how you lived. Because if time is structured according to cosmic harmonics, then human society should be structured the same way. And this is exactly what we find. Their legal codes based on multiples of 60. Their economic systems using the same base. Their temples and palaces built according to the same ratios. Everything designed to resonate with the divine frequency. And kingship in this context becomes not political power, but a kind of priesthood. The king is the one who maintains the alignment between earthly order and cosmic order, who ensures that human time stays synchronized with divine time. And when that synchronization breaks, when the frequency drifts out of tune, that's when the flood comes, not as punishment, but as reset, as the universe correcting itself, clearing away the discord so that harmony can be reestablished. This is why the reigns before the flood are so long and so perfectly mathematical. They represent ages of complete alignment, periods when human consciousness was tuned to the cosmic frequency, and therefore experienced time differently, not as a river carrying you toward death, but as an ocean in which you simply existed, eternal presence rather than temporal progression. And the gods who ruled during these ages were not necessarily beings from elsewhere, but states of consciousness, ways of being human that we've forgotten. And what the King List is telling us is that these states are not lost forever. They're cyclical. They come and go like seasons. And just as kingship descended twice, once before the flood and once after, it could descend again. And maybe that's what the incomplete ending of the King List is hinting at, that the story is not over, that we're living in the between time, the pause before the next descent. And if we could learn to read the mathematics, to align ourselves with the cosmic frequencies that the Sumerians encoded in their impossible numbers, we might be able to participate in that descent, to call kingship down, not from heaven, but from within. Because perhaps heaven was never a place above us, but a state of coherence. And the gods were never beings outside us, but potentials within us. And the mathematics is the key that unlocks those potentials. Maybe what the Sumerians understood, and we've forgotten, is that reality is fundamentally mathematical. Not in the cold mechanistic sense of modern physics, but in the mystical sense of Pythagoras. That number is the language of creation. That the cosmos is a symphony, and everything in it a note in that vast composition. And to know the right numbers, to calculate the correct frequencies, is to participate in creation itself, to become co-composer with whatever intelligence structured the whole magnificent pattern. The King List, with its base 60 mathematics, and its processional harmonics, and its impossible yet perfectly calculated durations, is not trying to record what happened, but to preserve how to make it happen again. It's a formula, a recipe, an instruction set for tuning human consciousness to divine consciousness. And the reason it seems impossible to us is that we're trying to read it from the wrong state of awareness. We're standing outside the temple, trying to understand the ritual. But the ritual only makes sense from inside. When you're aligned, when you're tuned, when you've learned to think in harmonics rather than quantities. And perhaps that's the real meaning of kingship descending from heaven. Not that rulers came from the sky, but that consciousness descended from higher frequencies to lower ones, from the mathematical perfection of the cosmic mind into the dense materiality of earthly existence. And the flood represents the moment when that descent went too far, when we fell out of resonance entirely and forgot that we were ever anything other than flesh and time and dust. Your mind is opening now, isn't it? You're starting to see that the impossible numbers are not errors, but keys. That what seemed like mythology is actually mathematics, and what seemed like mathematics is actually music. And somewhere in that convergence of number and meaning, there's a doorway. A way back to the frequency that the Sumerians were trying to preserve. And the question is not whether any of this is true in some objective historical sense, but whether it's useful. Whether understanding that time can be experienced in radically different ways, depending on your state of consciousness, gives you access to something that our modern view of reality has closed off. Whether the reason we feel so cut off from meaning, so alienated from the cosmos, so trapped in these brief, brutal decades, is that we've lost the ability to read the cosmic mathematics, to align ourselves with the frequencies that govern not just the stars, but consciousness itself. Because there's one figure we haven't discussed yet, one name that appears throughout the King List and throughout all of Mesopotamian mythology. A god who was not a king, but a teacher, who descended from heaven not to rule, but to instruct, who gave humanity the arts and sciences, who taught the sacred mathematics, who built the first temples and established the first cities, and supposedly created humanity itself from clay, mixed with divine blood. And his name was ENKI. And if we want to understand what the King List is really telling us, if we want to decode the mathematics of the divine, we have to understand this figure who bridges heaven and earth, who is called the Lord of the Sacred Eye, the one who knows the secrets, the keeper of the ME, the divine decrees that structure reality itself. So let us descend now into his temple. Let us go down into the ABZU, where wisdom dwells in the deep waters. and see what ENKI has to teach us about the descent of kingship. Chapter 4. The Keeper of Secrets. You're descending into the ruins of Eridu, the first city, where according to every Sumerian text, kingship first descended from heaven. And the air grows cooler as you move down through the archaeological layers, through centuries and millennia of accumulated time, past the foundations of temples built and rebuilt 17 times on the same sacred spot, each generation trying to remember the design of the one that came before. And finally, you reach the lowest level, the oldest shrine, dating back more than 7,000 years, just mud and reeds shaped into something barely recognizable as architecture, yet already oriented to the cardinal directions, already positioned according to some cosmic blueprint that would be maintained for thousands of years. This place was sacred before writing existed, before cities rose, before kingship descended. Or perhaps this is where kingship descended, this spot where the fresh waters of the Euphrates met the salt waters of the marshes, where earth and water blurred together in a liminal zone that belonged neither to land nor sea. And according to Sumerian mythology, this was the domain of ENKI, the god of the deep waters, of wisdom, of crafts and creation. And his temple here was called the ABZU, the House of the Abyss, because it stood above, or perhaps gave access to the ABZU itself, the underground ocean that the Sumerians believed was the source of all fresh water, all fertility, all knowledge, the place where the divine decrees called Me were stored, the fundamental patterns that structured reality itself, laws not in the legal sense but in the cosmic sense, principles that governed everything from kingship to weaving to music to the movement of stars. You kneel in the dust where the temple once stood, and you try to imagine what the earliest worshippers felt in this place, whether they understood that they were building something that would echo through history, that 7,000 years later, someone would kneel in these same ruins trying to decode what they knew. And the deeper question is, what did they know? Because the mythology around ENKI is strange. He's not like the other gods, not distant or wrathful or particularly concerned with being worshipped. Instead, he's described almost as a scientist or engineer. He measures, he calculates, he creates, not through raw power, but through knowledge, through understanding the principles by which things work. And when he creates humanity, according to the myths, he doesn't speak them into existence or shape them from nothing. He takes clay and mixes it with the blood of a slain god, and fashions bodies according to a plan, as though creation were a kind of technology, a craft that could be learned and taught and preserved. And perhaps that's exactly what ENKI represents in the Sumerian consciousness, not a being who existed in the distant past, but a principle that still operates, the idea that knowledge is the bridge between divine and human, that understanding the deep patterns, the mathematics and harmonics that govern reality, is what allows consciousness to ascend, to participate in creation rather than just being subjected to it. And if kingship descended from heaven, then ENKI was the channel through which it descended, the keeper of the frequency, the one who knew how to tune human awareness to cosmic awareness. And what he taught, what he preserved in his temple by the waters, that's what we're trying to remember. In Sumerian mythology, ENKI is called by many names: Ea in Akkadian, the Lord of Earth and Water, the God of Wisdom and Magic. But his most revealing title is Lord of the Sacred Eye, which suggests not just wisdom, but perception, the ability to see what others cannot, to detect the hidden patterns, to read the cosmic mathematics. And in every story about ENKI, he's solving problems not through force, but through cleverness, through understanding systems and finding elegant solutions. When the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, it's ENKI who warns Ziusudra, and tells him how to build a boat. When the gods are exhausted from the labor of maintaining the world, it's ENKI who creates humans to take over that work. When the goddess Inanna needs the ME to bring civilization to her city Uruk, it's ENKI who possesses them, keeps them in his ABZU, and must be tricked into releasing them. There's something almost playful about ENKI in these myths. He's not the stern father figure like Enlil, or the distant sky god like Anu. He's the trickster, the boundary crosser, the one who gives knowledge to humans, even when the other gods think humans shouldn't have it. And this makes him fundamentally different from the other deities, more accessible, more invested in human flourishing. And perhaps that's because ENKI represents something different. Not divine power imposing order from above, but consciousness itself, learning to navigate reality, making mistakes, finding solutions, evolving. The texts describe ENKI's abode in the ABZU as containing all knowledge, not just practical knowledge like farming and metalworking, but cosmic knowledge, the secrets of creation, the true names of things, the mathematics by which the universe operates. And access to this knowledge was what made kingship possible. Because a king was not just a political ruler, but a kind of priest-scientist who had been initiated into ENKI's mysteries, who understood the ME and could apply them to organize society according to cosmic principles. And this is why the King List begins at Eridu, because Eridu was ENKI's city, the place where the knowledge was kept, where the connection between heaven and earth was strongest, where kingship could descend because the temple was properly tuned, the mathematics were correct, the frequency was aligned. What's remarkable about Eridu when you examine the archaeological evidence is how deliberately it was situated, not just near water, but at the precise point where multiple ecosystems met, marshland and desert, fresh water and salt, providing access to an enormous range of resources, fish and fowl from the marshes, game from the desert, trade routes by water. And this diversity would have made Eridu exceptionally wealthy and stable. But more than that, it made it a liminal space, a threshold between different states of being. And threshold spaces are always sacred, because they're where transformation happens, where one thing becomes another. And perhaps that's the real reason ENKI's temple was here, because this landscape itself was teaching the lesson ENKI embodied, that wisdom comes from understanding boundaries, from seeing how different systems interact and influence each other. The ME are one of the strangest concepts in Sumerian theology. They're usually translated as divine decrees or divine powers, but neither translation quite captures what they were. They seem to have been something like the source code of reality, fundamental patterns or principles that governed everything from abstract concepts like justice and kingship to concrete skills like metalworking and brewing beer. And they existed not as ideas, but as almost physical objects that could be possessed, stolen, lost, and recovered. And whoever held the me for a particular domain had authority over that domain. In the myth of Inanna and ENKI, the goddess travels to Eridu and gets ENKI drunk, and while he's intoxicated, she convinces him to give her the me, all of them. Over 100 different me covering every aspect of civilization. And she loads them onto her boat and flees back to Uruk. And when ENKI sobers up and realizes what he's done, he tries to get them back, but it's too late. Inanna has brought civilization to her city. And this story is revealing, because it suggests the me were not infinite or omnipresent, but limited, specific, located. They had to be in one place or another, and their distribution determined the distribution of power and knowledge across the world. The me include things you'd expect like kingship and priesthood and warfare, but also unexpected things like the art of lovemaking, the craft of music, the skill of debate, even specific emotions like fear and pity. As though the Sumerians understood that every human capacity, every aspect of culture and consciousness, had a divine template, an ideal form that existed in some realm beyond the material. And the me were how you accessed those templates, how you brought the perfect forms into manifestation in the imperfect world. What this implies about Sumerian cosmology is profound. It means they didn't see human culture as something that gradually evolved through trial and error, but as something that was revealed, downloaded, accessed from a source that existed before humans and outside humans. And ENKI was the keeper of that source, the guardian of the database. And his role was to release the me into the world in the right way, at the right time, so that civilization could unfold according to the cosmic plan. And this is exactly what we see in the King List. Kingship doesn't emerge from human invention. It descends from heaven. It comes as a complete system, a me that includes all the knowledge needed to organize society, to build cities, to maintain order. And it descends to Eridu first, because that's where ENKI is, where the connection to the ABZU is strongest, where the me are most accessible. But here's the question that haunts this mythology. Where did the me come from? Who or what created them? Because ENKI has them, but he didn't make them. They pre-exist him. They're older than the gods themselves. They're the structure by which even the gods operate. And this suggests something the Sumerians seem to understand intuitively. That intelligence is not created, but discovered. That the patterns by which mind organizes reality are not arbitrary human inventions, but reflections of something fundamental to the cosmos itself. Mathematics, not as a tool we developed, but as a language we learned to speak, or perhaps remembered how to speak. Because the me are not gifts in the sense of being new. They're revelations in the sense of being uncovered, recovered, remembered from a time before time, when everything was known, because there was no separation between knower and known, between consciousness and cosmos. And this brings us back to the King List and its impossible numbers, because if the me exist, if there really are cosmic templates for every human capacity and cultural form, then perhaps what the antediluvian kings were doing during their thousands of years of rule was not governing in any political sense, but channeling, maintaining the pure, unbroken connection to the me, keeping human society aligned with the cosmic patterns. And their reigns were long not because they lived long, but because they ruled correctly, perfectly, in complete harmony with the divine decrees. And time, in that state of alignment, flowed differently, felt different, was different. In some essential way we can no longer access because we've lost the connection. The flood severed it. And after the flood, the me had to be recovered, piecemeal, redistributed through the efforts of figures like Inanna, stealing them from ENKI. And civilization became this fragmented thing, powerful in places, but never again whole, never again perfectly tuned to the cosmic frequency. ENKI belongs to a class of deities the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, a word that gets translated various ways, but seems to mean something like, those who from heaven to earth came. And the Anunnaki are described in the texts not as abstract spiritual beings, but as physical entities with specific roles and responsibilities. They're not omnipotent or omniscient. They have limitations. They make mistakes. They get tired and frustrated. They even die, or at least can be killed. And they're organized into a kind of cosmic bureaucracy, with Anu at the top as sky god, Enlil as lord of the air and earth, and Enki as lord of the waters and the underworld. And below them are 50 or sometimes 600 lesser Anunnaki who carry out various functions, managing the natural world, overseeing human affairs, maintaining the machinery of reality. The texts are quite specific about this. The Anunnaki are workers. They're described as digging canals, clearing land, performing labor. And at some point, they rebel against this work and complain to Enlil that they're exhausted. And this is when Enki proposes creating humans, beings who can take over the labor so the Anunnaki can rest. And he creates humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, specifically the god Kingu who led the rebellion. So humans are made from earth and divine essence, matter and consciousness combined. And our purpose, according to this creation myth, is to maintain the world, to be the hands and feet of the divine in physical reality, continuing the work of channeling cosmic order into earthly form. Now, if you take this literally, as some researchers do, you get ancient astronaut theories, the idea that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials who came to Earth and created humans through genetic engineering. And there are elements in the Sumerian texts that seem to support this reading. Descriptions of the Anunnaki descending in vehicles, references to their homeland as being in the heavens, the detail about mixing divine blood with clay, which sounds like it could be describing some kind of biological manipulation. But perhaps we're meant to read it metaphorically, not as beings from another planet, but as states of consciousness, the Anunnaki representing higher orders of awareness that descended into material form, that took on the work of organizing matter according to intelligent principles, and humans representing the next stage of that descent, consciousness embedded so deeply in matter that it forgets its divine origin, becomes fully identified with the physical. And the rebellion and the creation of humans represents the moment when pure intelligence chooses to limit itself, to constrain itself within biological forms so it can experience reality from the inside, can learn what it's like to be finite and mortal and subject to time. And the whole long process of human history is consciousness, slowly waking up to what it really is, remembering its divine nature while still embodied in flesh. And kingship, in this reading, is the evolutionary mechanism, the ladder by which consciousness climbs back toward its source. Each king representing a slightly higher frequency of awareness, until finally, the king and the god become indistinguishable, and heaven and earth are one again. Perhaps what ENKI represents, and what the ME embody, is the principle that knowledge is never really lost, only forgotten. That everything humans have ever discovered, or created, or thought, already exists as potential in the structure of reality itself, waiting to be accessed. And what we call progress, or invention, or inspiration, is actually remembrance, the recovering of patterns that were always there. And this explains why the same ideas, the same technologies, the same symbols appear independently in cultures that supposedly never had contact, not because of some universal human psychology, but because they're all tapping into the same source, the same ABZU where the me are stored. And the great teachers of history, the ones we remember as founders of religions, or inventors of sciences, or creators of new ways of being, they weren't making things up. They were downloading, channeling, translating into human terms what they perceived in those deep waters where ENKI dwells. And if this is true, then the goal of human development is not to create something new, but to remember something old. Not to progress forward into unprecedented territory, but to spiral back around to wisdom we once possessed and lost. And the King List, with its structure of descent and flood and descent again, is showing us this pattern, reminding us that we've been here before, that what seems like the end is really the middle, that kingship will descend again, because it must. Because that's the nature of the cycle. And when it does, we might recognize it not as something coming from outside, but as something rising from within, from the depths where ENKI waits with all knowledge, patient as water, ready to teach anyone who descends far enough to find him. We're more than halfway through this journey now, and the mystery is deepening rather than resolving, which is exactly as it should be, because we're not dealing with simple facts that can be stated and verified, but with something more like a frequency that has to be tuned into, and each chapter is adjusting your awareness, slightly, preparing you to perceive what the Sumerians were preserving, which is not information, but transformation, not knowledge about consciousness, but a technology for transforming consciousness itself. And ENKI is the key, because he represents the principle of descent, the willingness of intelligence to move down into matter, to limit itself for the sake of experience, to forget what it knows so it can have the joy of remembering. And perhaps that's what the me really are, not rules imposed from above, but invitations, each one a doorway into a different aspect of what it means to be human. And when you step through that doorway, you're not learning something new. You're becoming something you always were, potentially. You're manifesting a pattern that existed before you were born and will exist after you die. And the question is not, where did these patterns come from? But how do we align ourselves with them? How do we tune ourselves to the frequencies they emit? And the answer the Sumerians discovered is through structure, through building physical forms that embody the patterns, temples that mirror the cosmos, cities that reflect the sacred mathematics, and most importantly, through consciousness itself, learning to hold the patterns, to become a living temple, a walking embodiment of the me. And this is what kingship really was, not political power, but this capacity to channel divine order into human form, to be a bridge. And the next chapter will show us how this was done, how the Sumerians literally built bridges between heaven and earth, structures designed not for worship, but for connection, for maintaining the alignment, even as the flood tried to wash it away. So let us ascend now from the depths of the ABZU. Let us rise from the underground waters where ENKI dwells, and look up at what the ancient builders created. The Ziggurats that still dot the Mesopotamian plain like mountains raised by will. And understand what they were really for. Chapter 5. Stairways to Heaven. You're standing before the ruins of the great Ziggurat of Ur, its massive stepped pyramid rising against the desert sky like a mountain that should not exist in this flat alluvial plain. And even in its ruined state, even with 3,000 years of wind and sand wearing away its edges, it still dominates the landscape, still draws your eye upward, still suggests something beyond the merely human. And you place your hand against the ancient brick, feeling the heat the sun has stored there. And you try to imagine what this place was like when it was whole, when its walls were painted and glazed, when priests climbed the long stairway to the temple at its summit, when the whole structure was alive with ritual and meaning, when it functioned as it was designed to function, not as a monument to human achievement, but as a machine for connecting earth to heaven. The ziggurat is not what you expected if you came here thinking of Egyptian pyramids. Those are tombs, sealed chambers designed to protect the dead in their journey to the afterlife. But the ziggurat is the opposite. It's open, accessible. Its stairways invite ascent. And at its top is not a burial chamber but a temple. A small room barely large enough for a bed and an altar. And according to Sumerian texts, this room was where the god would descend to meet with the high priestess, where heaven and earth would literally touch, where the divine would take physical form for one night, and the connection would be renewed, the frequency retuned, the alignment restored. And in the morning, the priestess would emerge and tell the king what the god had revealed, what adjustments needed to be made to keep society synchronized with cosmic order. But here's what makes your breath catch as you look up at the weathered steps climbing toward the sky. The ziggurat at Ur is not unique. They built these all over Mesopotamia. Every major city had one. And they were not small projects. The ziggurat of Babylon was 300 feet high. The one at Ur that you're standing before was 70 feet. And the labor to construct them was enormous. Millions of mud bricks, each one individually formed and baked. Decades of work, generations of workers. And they kept building them, kept rebuilding them. Even after earthquakes knocked them down, even after floods undermined their foundations, even after conquest and destruction, they would return and rebuild on the same spot, according to the same design. As though the location mattered, as though there was something about these particular points on the earth that made them suitable as connection points, as though the whole landscape of Mesopotamia was a kind of circuit board, and the ziggurats were where the current flowed from heaven into earth. And if you look at them from above, if you map their positions, you start to see patterns. They're not randomly distributed, but seem to be placed according to some principle, some sacred geometry that we've lost the key to. And this makes you wonder what the Sumerians knew about the structure of space, about the hidden architecture of reality, about how to build not just buildings, but portals, thresholds, doors between worlds. The word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning to build high. But the Sumerians called them by various names, the most revealing being mountain house, or bond between heaven and earth. And this tells you immediately that they understood these structures as functional, not decorative. They were technology, devices for maintaining the connection that the flood had weakened, for creating sacred space, where the divine could still touch the human, where kingship could still descend, even if it could no longer remain permanently as it had in the antediluvian age. And the design of the ziggurat reflects this function. It's not a tower reaching ambitiously toward heaven like Babel. It's a stairway, an invitation, a platform that makes the distance smaller. And its stepped structure creates multiple levels, multiple zones of increasing holiness as you ascend. The base open to everyone, the middle levels restricted to priests, the summit accessible only to the high priestess or the king. And at each level you're leaving more of the earthly world behind, shedding the profane, becoming gradually more attuned to the sacred frequency, until at the top you're as close to heaven as a human can get while still standing on earth. What's remarkable when you study the ziggurats is how consistent their design is across centuries and cities. They all use the same basic structure. A square or rectangular base, 3 or 7 tiers depending on the period, stairways on the sides leading to the summit, and a temple at the top. And this consistency suggests they were following a template, not inventing new forms but copying an original design that had been revealed or remembered. And this fits with what we know about Eridu, because excavations there revealed 17 layers of temples, each built directly on top of the one before. And the earliest of these, dating back 7,400 years, shows the same basic plan as the latest. The same orientation, the same proportions, as though the design was perfect from the beginning and needed only to be maintained. And perhaps this is exactly right. Perhaps the design was perfect because it was a me, one of those cosmic patterns that ENKI kept in the ABZU, the template for temple, the ideal form that had to be manifested in physical materials as precisely as possible so it could function as it was meant to function, as a resonator, an amplifier, a transducer that converted cosmic energy into earthly form and earthly prayers into cosmic language. The materials mattered too. The Ziggurats were built primarily from mud brick, the most humble and local of materials, earth mixed with water and shaped and baked, which means these massive structures were literally made from the same substance humans were made from, according to the creation myths. Clay given form through knowledge and labor. And this was not an accident or a limitation of available resources. It was theological. The ziggurat had to be made of earth because it was earth reaching toward heaven. It was matter organized by consciousness. It was the principle of creation itself made visible. And the fact that mud brick is not durable, that it erodes and collapses and requires constant maintenance, that was part of the point. The ziggurat was not meant to last forever as a static monument. It was meant to be a living structure, continuously maintained, continuously rebuilt, continuously requiring human effort and attention. Because the work of maintaining the ziggurat was itself a ritual, a way of staying aligned with the divine through physical labor, through the discipline of keeping something impermanent from disappearing. And this mirrors the human condition itself. We are not permanent. We require constant effort to maintain. We are always being unmade by time and must choose again and again to remake ourselves, to rebuild our connection to what's sacred. When archaeologists began to study the orientations of the ziggurats, they discovered something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. These structures were precisely aligned with celestial markers. The corners pointed to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that suggests sophisticated surveying tools or astronomical knowledge. The walls were parallel and perpendicular within fractions of a degree. The proportions of length and width and height followed mathematical ratios that show up in nature, in music, in the orbits of planets. And, most significantly, many of the ziggurats were aligned with specific stars or star systems that held religious significance. The White Temple at Uruk was positioned so that on certain nights of the year, the planet Venus would appear directly above its summit when viewed from the base. And Venus was the planet of Inanna, the goddess whose temple this was. So the alignment meant that when you stood at the bottom of the ziggurat and looked up on those sacred nights, you would see the goddess herself, represented by her star, standing atop her earthly house. And the priestess at the summit would be standing at the exact point where earth and heaven intersected, where the goddess above and the goddess below were one. This was not symbolic, or rather, it was symbolic and literal at once. Because for the Sumerians, the line between symbol and reality was not sharp. A symbol that was correctly constructed, that properly reflected the cosmic pattern it represented, didn't just point to the sacred. it became sacred. It functioned as a portal through which the divine could flow into the material world. And the ziggurat was the ultimate symbol reality. It was a physical structure that you could touch and climb and measure. But it was also a diagram of the cosmos, a three-dimensional mandala, a yantra in brick. And to stand at its summit was to occupy the center of the universe, the axis mundi, the point around which all of reality turned. The number of steps, the number of tiers, the dimensions of each level. None of this was arbitrary. It was all calculated according to the sacred mathematics, multiples of 60 and 6 and 7, numbers that had cosmic significance, that resonated with the structure of time and space. And when you performed the correct rituals on the correct days, at the correct times, while standing at the correct positions on the ziggurat, you were not just praying to the gods, you were tuning yourself to their frequency. You were becoming part of the cosmic machinery, a conscious element in the universal order. And this is what made kingship possible after the flood. This technology of alignment. The ziggurat functioned as an artificial mountain, and mountains in ancient cosmology were naturally sacred because they were the highest points of Earth, the places that reached closest to heaven. But Mesopotamia had no mountains. It was flat, alluvial plain, so they built mountains. They created the conditions for descent, through architecture, through the application of knowledge, through understanding that form affects consciousness, and consciousness affects reality. And if you can build the right form in the right place, with the right proportions, you can create a kind of standing wave, a resonance between earth and heaven, that allows energy and information to flow between them. Modern studies using ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors have discovered something strange about some of the ziggurat sites. There are anomalies in the electromagnetic field, variations in the local gravity, underground water sources that converge beneath the structures. And while mainstream archaeology dismisses these as coincidence or geological quirks, they fit too well with the Sumerian understanding of sacred space. These sites were chosen because they were already special, already points where Earth's energy was concentrated. And the ziggurats were built to focus and amplify that energy, to create a clear channel for whatever force or intelligence the Sumerians were trying to contact. And this raises uncomfortable questions about what they actually knew, how they detected these subtle variations in the planetary field, what instruments or senses they possessed that allowed them to map the invisible architecture of space and build according to its requirements. Because if they could do that, if they really understood how to manipulate consciousness through geometry and orientation and resonance, then maybe the kingship that descended from heaven was not metaphor at all, but literal description of what happened when you tuned the ziggurat correctly, when you performed the rituals precisely, when you aligned your consciousness perfectly with the cosmic frequency. Something descended, some order or intelligence or pattern that entered through the structure and manifested through the priestess or king. And for that moment, heaven and earth were one again. The separation healed, the flood undone, and the impossible became briefly possible. What moves you most as you stand in the ruins is not the scale or the precision, but the persistence. The fact that they kept building these structures for thousands of years, kept rebuilding them after they collapsed, kept maintaining the old designs even as their civilization changed and evolved and eventually fell. because the ziggurat was not just important to the Sumerians. It remained central to Babylonian and Assyrian culture. It passed into Persian and eventually into Islamic architecture, the stepped pyramid becoming the minaret, the stairway to heaven becoming the call to prayer. And even today, when we build our skyscrapers and towers, when we create structures that reach upward, when we put observatories and communication arrays and temples at the top of our tallest buildings, we're following the same impulse. We're still trying to get closer to heaven, still trying to build our way out of the earthbound condition, still trying to create physical structures that will help us transcend physical limitations. And perhaps this is one of the fundamental human capacities that ENKI released into the world, the knowledge that consciousness can be affected by form, that where you are changes what you can perceive, that height gives perspective, and perspective changes understanding. And if you go high enough, if you ascend far enough, you might break through entirely into a different mode of awareness, might touch something vast that you cannot reach from ground level. The ruins of the ziggurats scattered across Iraq and Syria and Turkey are mostly just mounds now, tells that rise above the desert floor, and only through excavation and reconstruction can you see what they were. But there's something appropriate about their ruined state, about the way they've been worn down by time and returned partially to the earth they were made from. Because they were never meant to be eternal. They were meant to be maintained, and when the culture that maintained them disappeared, when the knowledge of their function was lost, when the frequency they transmitted was no longer being received, they slowly collapsed back into formlessness, waiting, like everything else from that age, for someone to remember, for consciousness to evolve far enough to recognize what it's looking at, to see in these mounds not the pride of ancient kings or the superstition of primitive peoples, but something more interesting and more useful, a technology for transformation, a method for ascending, a map showing the way from earth to heaven. And the map is still here, still readable, still functional, if we can learn the language it's written in, if we can recover the mathematics, if we can remember that building is not just construction, but a kind of prayer, and architecture not just shelter, but a tool for tuning consciousness. And maybe that's the lesson the Ziggurats teach most clearly. That the sacred is not somewhere else, not in some distant heaven we can never reach, but right here, right now, accessible through structure and discipline, and the patience to climb step by step toward whatever waits at the summit. Perhaps what the Sumerians understood that we've forgotten is that consciousness is affected by geometry, that the shape of the space you're in changes the shape of your awareness, that a circle feels different from a square, feels different from a spiral. And these differences are not subjective or cultural, but fundamental, rooted in how consciousness itself interacts with the mathematical structures that underlie physical reality. And if this is true, then the ziggurat was not just a symbol of cosmic order, but an instrument for producing it, a device that, by virtue of its proportions and orientation and position, created a field, a zone where the normal rules were slightly suspended, where consciousness could expand beyond its usual limits, where the impossible 36,000-year consciousness of the antediluvian kings could be briefly accessed again. Not permanently, as it once was, but for moments, flashes, glimpses, long enough to receive guidance, to download the next piece of the me, to remember what had been forgotten, and bring it back down the stairway to the people waiting below. We've lost this technology, not because it didn't work, but because we stopped believing it could work, because we adopted a view of reality where consciousness is just a product of brain chemistry, and buildings are just arrangements of matter, and nothing connects except through physical force. And in that view, the ziggurat becomes inexplicable, meaningless, a waste of resources. But what if the view is wrong? What if consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative? What if it responds to pattern and geometry and orientation, the way a radio responds to frequency?
And what if the Sumerians knew this and built accordingly? We've climbed high now in this exploration. We've ascended from the clay tablets to the mathematics, to the gods, to the structures, and a picture is emerging of a civilization that understood something profound about the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, between human and divine, between earth and heaven. And what's becoming clear is that the King List is not an isolated document, but part of a total system, a comprehensive technology for maintaining alignment with cosmic order. And every element reinforces every other element. The mathematics encodes the astronomy, which determines the architecture, which focuses the ritual, which tunes the consciousness, which downloads the knowledge, which informs the governance, which organizes the society, which builds the temples, which enable the mathematics to be rediscovered, and the cycle continues. Or it would continue if the transmission hadn't been interrupted, if the flood hadn't broken something essential. But here's what the Ziggurats prove. The Sumerians didn't give up after the flood. They adapted. They found new ways to maintain the connection. They built these massive structures to do artificially what used to happen naturally, to create through effort and knowledge and stone what used to be given freely. And maybe that's the real story of post-Diluvian humanity. We're trying to rebuild what was lost, using fragments of memory and flashes of insight to reconstruct the me, piece by piece. And every ziggurat is evidence that we remember, that somewhere deep in the human psyche there's still the knowledge that we're meant to be connected to something larger. And the question that brings us to our next chapter is whether this memory exists only in the Sumerians, or whether it echoes across the ancient world. Whether other civilizations built their own ziggurats under different names, whether the pattern of divine kingship and catastrophic flood and the struggle to reconnect is uniquely Mesopotamian or universally human. So let us step back now. Let us look at the whole ancient world and see if the echo of Sumer can be heard in places that supposedly never knew Sumer existed. Chapter 6. The Echo Across Civilizations. You're standing in front of a map of the ancient world, a map that shows not modern borders, but the locations of the earliest civilizations. And as your eyes move across the parchment, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, to the Indus Valley, to China, to Mesoamerica, something begins to disturb you. Not because these civilizations are different, but because they're too similar. Because the same patterns keep appearing in places that supposedly never had contact. And the pattern is this: divine rulers who lived for impossible spans of time, a golden age of harmony and wisdom, a catastrophic flood that ended everything. And then the struggle to rebuild, to reconnect with what was lost. And you start to wonder whether this is coincidence, whether human psychology just naturally produces these myths, or whether something else is happening. Whether all these cultures are remembering the same event, describing the same reality in different languages. And the more you look, the more the evidence accumulates. Not proof exactly, but resonance. The kind of harmony that happens when multiple instruments are playing variations on the same fundamental note. And that note is the King List,
or rather, what the King List represents. The memory of a time before the flood, when consciousness was different, when time flowed differently, when heaven and earth had not yet been separated by catastrophe. In Egypt, the priests told Herodotus about the dynasties that came before the human pharaohs, the time called Zep Tepi, meaning the first time, when gods ruled directly over the land of the Nile. And these divine dynasties lasted for thousands upon thousands of years, numbers that rival the Sumerian King List in their impossible scale. And after the gods came the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus, demigod beings who ruled for centuries, and only after them came mortal pharaohs, whose reigns could be measured in decades. And the transition between these ages was marked by chaos and destruction, by the goddess Sekhmet nearly destroying humanity, by the waters of Nun threatening to return and dissolve the ordered world back into primordial ocean. And it's the same pattern, the same structure of descent and fall, and the painful reconstruction of order from the fragments that survived. And when you read the Egyptian texts alongside the Sumerian ones, you can't help but feel you're reading two chapters of the same book, two versions of the same history, told by cultures that supposedly developed independently, that supposedly never influenced each other, yet somehow arrived at nearly identical cosmologies, nearly identical chronologies, nearly identical understandings of how the world began and how it fell, and what humanity's task is in the aftermath. And it's not just Egypt. In the Vedic traditions of India, there are the yugas, vast cycles of time. And the first of these is Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when humans lived in perfect harmony with cosmic law, when lifespans stretched for 100,000 years, when there was no disease or death or suffering, because consciousness was still aligned with Dharma, with the fundamental order of reality. And then, through successive ages, Treta Yuga and Dvapara Yuga, and finally our current age, Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, everything contracts, lifespans shrink, wisdom fades, the gods withdraw, and we're left with these brief, brutal decades, trying to remember what our ancestors knew. And the transition between ages is marked by pralaya, by dissolution, by waters that rise to cleanse the world of accumulated disorder. And it's the same story again, the same arc from divine harmony to catastrophic separation to the long struggle toward recovery. And you begin to suspect that these are not myths, or rather that myth is not fiction, but memory. Memory of something so vast and so traumatic that it could only be preserved in symbolic form, encoded in stories that could survive the very disaster they describe. The biblical patriarchs present the same pattern in condensed form. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 905, and the numbers continue in this range through the generations until you reach Noah, who lived 950 years, and survived the flood that destroyed the antediluvian world. And after the flood, the lifespans begin to drop. Abraham lived 175 years, Isaac 180, Jacob 147. And by the time you reach Moses, the lifespan has contracted to 120 years. And the Psalms declare that a human life is 70 years, or perhaps 80 if you're strong. And we've arrived at the modern human condition, at time as we experience it, compressed and finite. And the question is whether this pattern in Genesis is borrowing from the earlier Sumerian tradition, whether the Hebrew scribes knew about the King List and adapted it, or whether both traditions are preserving the same memory independently, both trying to explain why the world feels diminished, why we live such brief lives, Why the gods who once walked among us are now silent. And the flood is the explanation. The event that marks the boundary. The catastrophe that separated us from our divine heritage. And this is not just theological speculation. It's embedded in the structure of time itself, according to these texts. Something happened that literally changed how time flows, that made human consciousness contract from the vast awareness that could encompass millennia into the narrow tunnel of a human lifetime, where 70 years is considered long. In Greek mythology, you have the succession of ages that Hesiod describes. The Golden Age, when humans lived like gods, without sorrow or toil, when the earth gave forth its fruits freely and no one had to work, when death came gently, like sleep, and there was no violence or greed or fear. And this age was ruled by Kronos, who represents time in its eternal aspect, cyclical time, sacred time, time that curves back on itself. And then the Golden Age ended, and the Silver Age began, less perfect, but still blessed. And then the Bronze Age of warriors, and finally the Iron Age, which is our age, the age of hard labor and constant struggle, where humans are born to trouble as sparks fly upward. And the transition between ages is marked by Zeus sending floods to destroy the wicked, by Deucalion and Pyrrha building an ark and surviving to repopulate the earth. And it's the exact same structure, the same movement from divine perfection through gradual decline to catastrophic reset. And what's remarkable is that Hesiod presents this not as mythology, but as history, as the actual sequence of ages that the world has passed through. And he writes in the 8th century before the Common Era, with a kind of nostalgia for what was lost, with the sense that his own age is impoverished compared to what came before. And perhaps he's right. Perhaps every age since the Golden Age has been impoverished, has been dealing with less and less of the original light, like a signal, degrading as it travels. And we're at the far end of transmission, receiving only fragments of what was once a complete and perfect message. Even in the Americas, in Mesoamerica, where the contact with the old world is supposed to be impossible, you find the same pattern. The Maya and Aztec traditions speak of 4 previous worlds, 4 suns that rose and fell before the current world began. And each previous world was destroyed by catastrophe, by flood or fire or earthquake, by the gods, deciding that their creation was flawed and needed to be remade. And the humans of those previous worlds were different from us. In the first world, they were made of clay, but couldn't speak, so they were destroyed. In the second world, they were made of wood, but had no souls, so they were destroyed. And each successive creation was an improvement, but also a diminishment, closer to what we are now, more limited, more finite, more cut off from the divine source. And the calendrical systems of Mesoamerica are obsessed with these vast cycles of time. The long count calendar that measures ages in units of hundreds of thousands of years, suggesting that these cultures, like the Sumerians, understood that history operates on timescales far longer than individual human lives, that civilizations rise and fall in patterns that repeat across millennia. And the fact that they developed these sophisticated systems of measuring deep time, that they calculated the length of the solar year to within seconds of modern astronomy, that they tracked the precession of the equinoxes just like the Sumerians did. All of this suggests knowledge that shouldn't exist according to the standard historical narrative. Knowledge that seems to have come from somewhere, to have been inherited or remembered rather than gradually discovered. The standard academic explanation for these parallels is that they're either coincidence or the result of universal human psychology. The idea that all humans, everywhere, tend to imagine a paradise in the past and project their anxieties about mortality into myths about fallen ages and catastrophic floods. And there's undoubtedly some truth to this. Myths do express psychological patterns. They do externalize internal experiences. But this explanation becomes less satisfying the more you examine the details. Because it's not just that all cultures have flood myths. It's that the flood myths contain the same specific elements, the same sequence of events. A righteous man, warned by a god, builds a boat, saves his family and animals. The waters rise and destroy everything. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The survivors repopulate the earth. And this level of detail, this structural similarity across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, starts to strain the coincidence hypothesis. Starts to suggest that maybe they're all describing the same event, not metaphorically, but literally. That there really was a catastrophic flood, not necessarily global, but widespread enough that every culture that survived it retained the memory. Traumatic enough that it became the central event in their historical consciousness. The moment when everything changed. And the geological evidence supports this. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended, as the great ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt, sea levels rose dramatically. More than 400 feet over the course of several millennia. And while this was gradual on the scale of centuries, it would have been catastrophic on the scale of human lifetimes. Entire coastlines drowned, river valleys inundated. And if there were civilizations living on those coastlines and in those valleys, if there were cities and temples and libraries on land that is now underwater, then they're gone. Erased as completely as if they never existed. And the only record of them would be memory, stories passed down through generations, stories that would eventually be written down by cultures like the Sumerians, who inherited those memories and tried to preserve them. And perhaps that's what the King List really is, not a record of Sumerian history, but a record of pre-Sumerian history, the history of whatever civilization existed before the flood. The civilization that understood precession and built according to harmonic mathematics and organized society around divine kingship, and then was destroyed. And the Sumerians are not the originators, but the inheritors, the preservers, the ones who remembered enough to write it down. This would explain why Sumerian civilization appears so suddenly in the archaeological record, why they seem to arrive fully formed with writing and mathematics and astronomy and sophisticated agriculture and urban planning all at once, around 3,300 years before the Common Era, with no apparent developmental phase, no gradual progression from simple to complex. They just appear, like they're resuming something that was interrupted, rather than starting something new. And if this is true, then we have to radically revise our understanding of human history. We have to consider the possibility that civilization is much older than we think, that it has risen and fallen multiple times, that the Sumerians and Egyptians and the Indus Valley culture were all trying to remember and reconstruct something that had been lost. And the similarities between them are not due to contact or diffusion, but to the fact that they were all working from the same original template, all trying to recover the same me that ENKI had kept in the ABZU. And perhaps the me were never mythological at all, but were actual knowledge, actual technologies, actual sciences that a previous civilization had developed, and that survived the flood only in fragmentary form, scattered across the ancient world, preserved in myths and monuments and mathematical ratios, waiting for someone to recognize the pattern, and put the pieces back together. And maybe that's what we're doing right now. Maybe this investigation of the King List is part of that process of recovery, part of consciousness remembering what it forgot. And the reason these ancient texts still have power, still draw our attention, still generate endless speculation and debate, is that we recognize something in them, some truth that resonates with a part of us that's older than our individual lives, older than our culture, connected to the species' memory of a time when we knew more than we know now, when we were more than we are now, when the gods walked among us because we were the gods, or becoming them, ascending toward divine consciousness. And then the flood came, and we fell. And we've spent the last 10,000 years trying to climb back. Did these ancient civilizations have contact with each other? Did ideas spread through trade and migration and conquest? Is that why they share so many similarities? Or did they arrive at the same conclusions independently, because they were observing the same cosmos and detecting the same patterns? Or is there a third possibility, that they were all inheriting from a common source, a mother culture that predates all of them, that existed in the world before the flood, and whose knowledge survived in scattered form, fragments washing up on different shores? And each culture that found these fragments tried to understand them, to integrate them into their own context, to rebuild from the pieces they had. And this would explain both the similarities and the differences. The same core patterns expressed through different cultural lenses, the same mathematics appearing in different notations, the same cosmology described with different names for the gods. The evidence for actual contact is thin. There are suggestive hints. Egyptian and Sumerian artifacts found in each other's territories, linguistic similarities between Indo-European and Semitic languages that suggest ancient connections, cultural practices like mummification and pyramid building that appear in both old and new worlds. But none of it is conclusive. None of it proves direct transmission. And yet the parallels remain, stubborn and mysterious, demanding explanation. And the explanation that makes most sense is the one that seems most impossible to our modern minds. That these are not separate developments, but expressions of a unified human heritage. Memories of a time when humanity was one culture, one consciousness, before the dispersion, before Babel, before the flood divided us into isolated populations, each trying to remember what had been lost. And the King List is the oldest written expression of that memory. The first time someone thought to press into clay not just records of grain and tribute, but the story of where we came from, who we were, before we became what we are, and what we might become again if we can remember the pattern. Perhaps the greatest gift these ancient traditions give us is not historical information, but permission to imagine that human history is deeper and stranger than the textbooks allow. That we don't have to accept the narrative of linear progress from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to enlightened. That maybe it's more accurate to see history as a series of peaks and valleys, ages of high knowledge, followed by catastrophic forgetting, followed by slow recovery. And we may be in a valley right now. We may be the survivors of our own kind of flood, a flood of materialism that washed away our connection to the sacred, a flood of reductionism that narrowed our consciousness until we could only perceive a tiny bandwidth of reality. And the work of our age is the same work as the work of the Sumerians after their flood. To to rebuild, to recover the patterns that allow consciousness to ascend. And the ancient texts are not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated maps showing the territory we need to traverse. They're not telling us what to believe, but showing us what's possible, reminding us that humans have been here before, have faced this same challenge before, have found ways to reconnect heaven and earth even after catastrophe. And if they could do it, we can do it. If kingship descended once, it can descend again, not as political power, but as the restoration of cosmic order, not as domination, but as alignment. And the first step is recognizing that we're part of a pattern much larger than ourselves, that our brief lives are one note in a symphony that's been playing for tens of thousands of years. And the symphony is not random noise, but structured harmony. And if we can learn to hear it, if we can attune ourselves to its frequency, we might discover that we're not isolated accidents, but essential participants in something vast and meaningful and ongoing. The pattern is undeniable now. You can see it stretching across the ancient world. The same story told in different languages. The same memory preserved in different forms. And what it's telling us is that the Sumerians were not unique. They were not the sole possessors of this knowledge about divine kingship and cosmic mathematics and the catastrophe that separated us from our source. They were simply the first to write it down in a form that survived. But the knowledge itself is older and more widely distributed than any single civilization. It's human knowledge, species knowledge. And it's been trying to survive, trying to propagate itself forward through time, despite every obstacle, despite floods and conquests and book burnings, and the endless erosion of memory. And the fact that we can still read it, that we can still piece together the pattern from scattered fragments, that suggests the knowledge wants to be remembered, that it has a kind of agency, a kind of purpose. And maybe that purpose is exactly what the texts claim it is, to prepare humanity for the next descent, for the moment when kingship returns not from outside, but from within, when we collectively remember what we individually forgot, when the species consciousness ascends to the frequency where the gods dwell and discovers that the gods were always us, our future selves reaching back to help our past selves. And the whole elaborate structure of myth and mathematics and sacred architecture was a message from our own higher potential, trying to guide us home. And we're almost there now. We're approaching the end of this particular journey through the King List. We've seen the numbers and the gods and the structures and the global pattern. And there's only one question left. The question that's been hanging over everything since the beginning. The question that makes all of this matter. Which is not what happened in the past, but what happens next. Not whether kingship descended before, but whether it will descend again. And that's what the final chapter is about. Not endings, but openings. Not conclusions, but invitations. So let us prepare now to receive what the ancients prepared for us. Let us make ourselves ready for the unfinished song to find its next verse. Chapter 7. The Unfinished Song. You're holding the final fragment of the King List in your mind, turning it over like a piece of broken pottery. And what strikes you most is not what's there, but what isn't. Because every version of the King List that has been found, every copy made across different centuries and different cities, they all end abruptly, mid-sentence sometimes, trailing off into silence as though the scribe's hand simply stopped moving, as though there was nothing more to say, or perhaps too much. And for years, scholars assumed this was damage, that the tablets had broken and the endings were lost. But as more complete versions were discovered, the pattern remained. They all stop at roughly the same point in the historical sequence. They all leave the story unfinished. And you begin to suspect this was intentional, that the incompleteness is the point, that the Sumerians understood something about endings that we've forgotten, which is that nothing really ends. Everything cycles. Everything returns. And to write an ending would be to lie, to pretend that the pattern had completed, when in fact it was still unfolding, still waiting for its next iteration, still preparing for the moment when kingship would descend again. The last kings listed are mortal men with recognizable reigns, decades rather than millennia, rulers whose tombs have been excavated, whose wars and building projects are documented in other texts. And then the list simply stops, not with a flourish or a conclusion or a moral, but with silence. And that silence has been speaking for 5,000 years, asking everyone who reads it to complete the pattern, to add the next line, to participate in the continuation rather than passively receiving a finished story. And perhaps this is the deepest wisdom the King List contains. Not information about the past, but invitation into the future. Not telling you what happened, but asking what happens next. And the question of what happens next is not abstract or theoretical. It's immediate and personal. Because if the pattern is real, if history really does move in cycles of descent and flood and renewal, then we are somewhere in that cycle right now. We are living through one of its phases. And the question is, which phase? Are we before the flood or after it? Are we in the age of divine kings or the age of forgetting? Are we ascending toward connection or descending into separation? And depending on how you answer that question, depending on where you place yourself in the pattern, the King List becomes either a memorial to something lost or a map to something that can be recovered. Either a eulogy or an instruction manual. And the Sumerians in their wisdom left it ambiguous, left it open, gave us just enough pattern to recognize, but not enough closure to stop looking. And maybe that's because they understood that each age has to complete the pattern for itself, has to discover what kingship means in its own context, has to find its own way of bridging heaven and earth. And they could give us the mathematics and the mythology and the architecture, but they couldn't give us the experience that we have to generate ourselves. That's the work. That's what it means to be human in the time between descents, to hold the memory of what was and the vision of what could be, and to build the bridge between them with whatever materials we have available. And for us, in this age, the materials are different. We don't work in mud brick and cuneiform. We work in silicon and code, but the principle is the same. We're trying to create structures that embody cosmic patterns, trying to tune consciousness to frequencies beyond the merely human, trying to remember our way back to something we've never fully forgotten. Chapter 2, A. The incomplete ending. When you examine the various copies of the King List closely, studying not just what they say, but how they say it, you notice that the later sections are written differently from the earlier ones. The tone shifts, becomes less formulaic, more historical. The reigns are given in years that make sense. The kings have genealogies and relationships and conflicts. They're recognizably human. And this shift happens gradually. There's no sharp line. It's more like a fade, like watching divine time slowly dissolve into human time. Eternity contracting into history. And by the end, you're reading what feels like straightforward chronicle. King succeeded king. Dynasty replaced dynasty. Power moved from city to city. And then it stops. And the stop is jarring, because you expect some kind of summation, some statement about what it all means. But there's nothing. Just the last king's name and his reign. And then blank clay. And that blankness is profound. It's not emptiness, but potential. It's the space where the next inscription belongs, and the fact that it was never added, that no one wrote the next section, suggests that the next section can't be written yet, that it's waiting for something, for some event or realization or transformation that will make the pattern visible again, that will allow kingship to descend once more, and the chronicle to continue. Some of the tablet fragments end with a phrase that's easy to overlook, but becomes significant the more you think about it. The kingship was taken to the heavens, not descended but ascended, not coming down but going up. And this reverses the entire direction of the text, because the king list begins with kingship descending from heaven and chronicles its journey through the earthly realm. But if it ends with kingship returning to heaven, then the whole document is describing a cycle, a full rotation. Kingship comes down, manifests through various forms, and then withdraws. And the withdrawal is not abandonment, but completion, the pattern fulfilled. And if the pattern is cyclical, then the next phase after withdrawal is preparation for the next descent, the time between breaths. And perhaps that's where we are, in the pause, in the silence between the last ascent and the next descent. And the reason the king list stops is that there's nothing to record during this phase. No kings ruling with divine mandate. No clear channel between heaven and earth. Just humanity waiting, watching, remembering, and slowly, so slowly it's almost imperceptible, tuning ourselves back to the frequency that will allow kingship to descend again. But there's another way to read the incompleteness, which is that the king list was never meant to be complete, that it's not a chronicle that got interrupted, but a pattern that's inherently open-ended, a template that each civilization has to fill in with its own details. And the Sumerians gave us the beginning and the middle, and left the ending blank, because the ending belongs to us, whoever we are, whenever we are, whatever age we're living in. We're supposed to look at this ancient text and see ourselves in it, see our own struggles to maintain order and meaning in the face of chaos and forgetting, our own attempts to build structures that connect earth to heaven, our own experience of living in the time after the gods have withdrawn. And by seeing ourselves in the pattern, we become part of it. We take up the work that the antediluvian kings began, the work of consciousness evolving toward divinity. And the king list is not telling us how that work ends, because it hasn't ended. It's still ongoing. We're still in the middle of it. And that's why the text breaks off. Not because there's nothing more to say, but because the next part has to be lived rather than written. 2b, the cycle continues. 650. After the Sumerians came the Akkadians, and after the Akkadians came the Babylonians, and after the Babylonians came the Assyrians, and each of these cultures inherited the king list and added to it and modified it and preserved it. And what's remarkable is that they kept the beginning intact. They kept the antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns. They didn't rationalize them, or delete them, or explain them away. They maintained the pattern even as they added their own kings to the sequence, their own dynasties to the chronicle. As though they understood that their legitimacy depended on connection to that original descent. That to be a true king, you had to be part of an unbroken chain that stretched back to the moment when kingship first came down from heaven. And this tells you something important about how these cultures understood power. It wasn't something you seized or invented. It was something you inherited. You were a link in a transmission that began before history and would continue after you. And your job was not to break the chain, but to pass it forward, to keep the pattern intact so the next generation could access it. And in this way, the King List became self-fulfilling. It created the very continuity it described. By insisting that kingship descended from heaven, it made descent from heaven the criterion for kingship. And anyone who wanted to rule had to prove they were part of the pattern, had to show that the me had come to them, that they were aligned with cosmic order. And this created a kind of spiritual technology, a method for ensuring that rulers at least aspired to divine standards, even if they couldn't fully embody them. And the pattern didn't stop with ancient Mesopotamia. It continued through Persian and Greek and Roman concepts of divine kingship. It continued through the medieval doctrine of the divine right of kings. It continues even today in the way we talk about legitimate authority, about leaders who are in tune with the times, about governments that have lost their mandate. We're still using the vocabulary of dissent and withdrawal, even if we've forgotten where it comes from, even if we've secularized the language and stripped it of its cosmic context. And maybe that's the problem. Maybe the reason our institutions feel so empty, so disconnected from any sense of sacred purpose, is that we've tried to have kingship without heaven, tried to have order without alignment, tried to have authority without the divine mandate that makes authority meaningful rather than just coercive. And the result is this strange modern condition where we have unprecedented power and unprecedented knowledge, but no sense of what it's for, no vision of the pattern we're supposed to be serving. And the King List, if we could learn to read it properly, might show us what we're missing, might remind us that power without connection to something transcendent is just force, just domination, and that true kingship, the kind that descended from heaven in the antediluvian age, was something different, was consciousness aligned with cosmic principles, was the human becoming the channel through which divine order entered the world. The question then becomes not whether kingship exists anymore, but whether we're capable of recognizing it if it descended. Whether we've developed the sensitivity to detect those moments when consciousness breaks through into a higher frequency. When someone or something embodies the pattern so completely that you can feel the alignment, the rightness, the sense that this is how things are supposed to be. And these moments still happen in art, in music, in mathematics, in those rare instances when human creativity seems to tap into something beyond the personal, seems to channel rather than create. And maybe that's what kingship looks like in an age that doesn't believe in gods. It's those flashes of connection, those moments when we touch the pattern and the pattern touches us back. And if we could learn to recognize these moments, to cultivate them, to build our societies around them rather than ignoring them or dismissing them as subjective experience, we might discover that kingship never stopped descending. We just stopped building the structures that allow us to perceive it, stopped performing the rituals that attune us to its frequency, stopped believing that such things are possible, and our disbelief became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The descent continued, but we weren't there to receive it. There's a detail that appears on one of the King List fragments that's so small you could easily miss it. On the edge of the tablet, preserved accidentally in the clay, is a fingerprint. The ridge pattern of the scribe who pressed this text into being 5,000 years ago. And when you look at that fingerprint under magnification, you can see the individual lines, the unique pattern that belonged to one specific human being whose name we'll never know, whose life we can't reconstruct, but whose presence is undeniable. And there's something profoundly moving about this, about the way the imperfect, the accidental, the purely human persists alongside the cosmic and the eternal, the mathematics and the mythology. And perhaps that's the real message of the King List. Not that humans should transcend their humanity and become gods, but that humanity itself is sacred. That the work of pressing meaning into matter, of organizing chaos into pattern, of maintaining consciousness in the face of entropy, this is divine work. This is what kingship really means. And every human who does this work, who creates order from disorder, who preserves memory against forgetting, who builds beauty out of mud, is participating in the same pattern as the antediluvian kings, is channeling the same me that ENKI kept in the ABZU. The fingerprint reminds you that the King List was made by hand, by someone sitting at a desk in the afternoon heat with a reed stylus and a lump of wet clay, doing the work carefully, precisely, copying from an older tablet that was itself a copy, and knowing that this text mattered, that it had to be preserved, that something in it was essential, even if its meaning was already becoming obscure. And that act of preservation, that decision to continue the tradition, even when you don't fully understand it, that's an act of faith. Faith that meaning persists even when it's hidden, that the pattern continues even when we can't see it, that the work of maintaining the transmission is worthwhile, even if we never know what it's transmitting. And 5,000 years later, here you are, reading the words that scribe copied, making sense of patterns that might have been opaque even to him. And the chain holds. The transmission continues. And perhaps that's all we can do. Perhaps that's all we need to do. Keep the pattern alive. Keep asking the questions. Keep building the structures, even if we don't fully understand what they're for. Trust that meaning is embedded in the doing, that kingship descends not as a reward for understanding, but as a consequence of alignment. And alignment comes through practice, through repetition, through the faithful maintenance of forms whose purpose will only become clear later, maybe much later, maybe not in your lifetime, but in the lifetime of your civilization, or the one that comes after. Maybe the Sumerians were right about everything. Maybe kingship really did descend from heaven. Maybe there really was a time when consciousness was vast enough to perceive cosmic patterns directly, when humans lived for ages because they existed partially outside of linear time. And maybe the flood really happened and changed everything, not just destroying cities, but transforming the very structure of awareness. And maybe we really are living in the diminished age, the time of short lives and limited perception, trying to remember something we've almost forgotten. And if all of that is true, then the King List is the most important document in human history. Not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us what's possible. It proves that consciousness has been higher than this, that we've touched divinity before, and could touch it again. That the gods didn't die or abandon us, they withdrew to let us grow, to let us make the choice ourselves, whether to ascend or remain. And the choice is not made once, but continuously. Every moment that we choose pattern over chaos, meaning over nihilism, connection over isolation, we're choosing ascent. We're building the stairway. We're creating the conditions for descent. And maybe kingship is already returning. Maybe it's been returning all along, quietly, invisibly, through everyone who does the work of maintaining consciousness, of preserving beauty, of passing forward the memory of what we could be. The clay is silent now, but its message endures, pressed into matter by hands that knew they were making something that would outlast them, something that would speak across ages to anyone willing to listen. And you've listened. You followed the pattern from the impossible numbers, through the mathematics, through the gods, through the structures, through the global echo to this moment right now, where you understand something you didn't understand before. Not a fact you can prove, but a frequency you can feel. The sense that history is deeper than we've been told, that consciousness is stranger than we've imagined, that the ancients were not primitive but profound, and that we are not the culmination of progress, but the continuation of a cycle that's older than we can measure. And the question the King List leaves you with is not what to believe, but what to do. How to live in a world where kingship might descend again. How to prepare yourself and your civilization for that possibility. How to build your own ziggurat, your own stairway between earth and heaven, using whatever materials your age provides. And the answer is in the doing, in the faithful maintenance of pattern, in the work of consciousness refusing to accept that this limited bandwidth is all there is, reaching for something higher. Not because you're certain it exists, but because the reaching itself is divine, is human in the fullest sense, is what we were made for. And when kingship descended from heaven, perhaps what descended was not something external, but the recognition of what we already were. Consciousness seeing itself, the divine discovering itself in matter. And the flood separated us from that recognition, but didn't destroy it. And now the waters are receding, and the memory is returning, and the pattern is becoming visible again. And you are part of it. You always were. And the song that seemed unfinished is finishing itself through you, through everyone who remembers that we are more than we seem, that time is not as fixed as we pretend, that heaven is not somewhere else but here, waiting to be recognized, waiting to descend, waiting for us to remember that we are the ones we've been waiting for. The silence that speaks. You've traveled far through this ancient text, through numbers that defy comprehension, and gods who ruled for ages, and floods that divided time itself. And now you find yourself back where you started, standing in imagination before that first clay tablet, those wedge marks pressed into earth by hands that understood they were preserving something precious, something that had to survive the erosion of memory and the destruction of empires, and the endless forgetting that threatens every generation. And what they preserved was not just information, but invitation. Not just history, but possibility. The reminder that consciousness has been higher than this, that we have touched the divine before and left fingerprints in the clay to prove it. And those fingerprints are still here, still waiting, still speaking to anyone who stops long enough to listen to what the silence between the words is saying. The Sumerian King List does not give us certainty.
It gives us something better. It gives us mystery that demands engagement, pattern that invites participation, and in engaging with it, in trying to decode its impossible mathematics and understand its cosmic vision, we become part of the transmission. We take up the work that began 5,000 years ago, or 50,000, or 500,000. The work of consciousness, trying to remember itself, trying to reconnect with its source, trying to bridge the gap between heaven and earth that the flood created. And perhaps we're closer to that bridge than we think. Perhaps every moment we spend contemplating these ancient mysteries, every effort we make to see the pattern, every choice we make for meaning over meaninglessness, we're building another step, pressing another brick into place, ascending slowly toward the summit where the gods wait, or where we wait for ourselves.
Because maybe the descent of kingship was never about beings coming from outside, but about consciousness, recognizing what it already was. Divine intelligence embedded in matter, eternity, expressing itself through time, and the whole elaborate structure of myth and number and temple was just a way of remembering, just a technology for triggering the recognition. What the King List really tells us is that time is not what we think it is, that the past is not behind us, but beneath us, layered like the strata of an archaeological site. And the deepest layers are not the most primitive, but the most profound, closest to the source. And what we call progress is really just distance. We've moved forward, but we've also moved away, gained certain capacities, but lost others. And the question facing us now is whether we can integrate, whether we can reclaim the wisdom of the antediluvian age while maintaining the knowledge of our own age, whether we can have both the vast cosmic consciousness that experienced time as eternity and the focused historical consciousness that can write it down, remember it, transmit it. And if we can achieve that integration, then perhaps we will have completed the cycle, resolved the separation that the flood created, and kingship will descend again, not as external authority, but as internal recognition. The moment when humanity collectively remembers what it is, where it came from, what it's for. And the whole painful journey through history will reveal itself as necessary, as the path consciousness had to take to know itself fully, to experience limitation, so it could transcend limitation consciously, rather than just existing in limitless awareness unconsciously. And maybe that's what the gods were doing all along, descending into matter not to rule over us, but to become us, to experience existence from the inside, to learn what it means to forget, so that remembering would have meaning. And we are them. We always were. We are the gods after they fell, the divine after it fragmented. And the work of history is reassembly, remembering ourselves back into wholeness. The clay tablets scattered across museums and private collections and archaeological sites, each one a fragment of the larger pattern, each one preserving a piece of the transmission. Together, they form a message that transcends any single text. And the message is this: you are not alone. You are not the first to face the mystery of existence. You are part of a lineage that stretches back beyond memory. And everything you struggle with, every question you ask, every longing you feel for something more than the material world offers, these are ancient struggles, ancient questions, ancient longings. And they've been preserved, not just in texts, but in the structure of consciousness itself. You carry the memory, even if you don't remember. You know the pattern, even if you can't articulate it. And when you encounter these ancient texts and feel that strange shock of recognition, that sense of meeting something familiar in the most foreign context, that's not coincidence. That's remembering. That's the pattern recognizing itself across time. That's kingship beginning to descend again. Through you. Through everyone who refuses to accept that this limited awareness is all we're capable of. Who keeps reaching towards something higher, even when the culture tells us there's nothing there. Who maintains the transmission by adding their own effort to the effort of all those who came before, pressing their own meaning into clay, building their own ziggurat, step by step toward whatever waits at the summit. And maybe what waits at the summit is not something we'll find, but something we'll become. Not a destination, but a transformation. Not knowledge about the gods, but the experience of being divine. And if that sounds impossible or presumptuous or insane, then perhaps that's just the voice of the flood speaking. The voice of separation that convinced us we're small and finite and cut off from the cosmic order. But the King List tells a different story. It says we are the descendants of those who ruled for 36,000 years. We carry that potential in us whether we acknowledge it or not. We are compressed eternity. Divine consciousness experiencing itself through the narrow aperture of the human lifetime. And any moment we could remember. Any moment the aperture could open. Any moment kingship could descend. And we could see what the antediluvian kings saw. Feel what they felt. Know what they knew. And the fact that we don't, the fact that we remain in the limited awareness most of the time, that's not failure. That's the structure of the work. You can't ascend without first being at ground level. You can't reconnect without first being separated. You can't descend consciously without first having ascended unconsciously. And the whole cycle is designed to produce conscious divinity, awareness that knows itself as divine. And that's worth the fall. That's worth the flood. That's worth these long ages of forgetting and pain and struggle. Because when we finally remember, it won't be innocent return to the garden. It will be conscious reclamation of our heritage, and we'll be able to maintain it this time because we'll understand what it cost, what it took, how precious it is. The King List ends where your journey begins. The ancient scribes pressed into clay as far as they could see, and then left space for you to continue. Left silence for you to fill. Left the pattern incomplete so you could complete it. And the completion is not something you write. It's something you live. It's your life aligned with cosmic order. It's your consciousness ascending toward the frequency where kingship dwells. It's your daily choice to see pattern in chaos, meaning in suffering, divinity in matter. And when enough of us make that choice, when enough of us remember, when enough of us align, perhaps that's when kingship descends again. Not to one person, but to the species. Not to a place, but to consciousness itself. And we'll look back at these long ages of separation and see them not as tragedy, but as training, not as fall, but as preparation. And we'll understand, finally, what the Sumerians knew, that heaven and earth were never truly separate, that the flood was illusion, that kingship never stopped descending, we only stopped perceiving it. And the whole elaborate structure of history and myth and mathematics was just scaffolding, just support for consciousness, as it made the long journey from unconscious unity through conscious separation back to conscious unity. And now the scaffolding can fall away, because the structure is complete, or completing, or preparing to complete, and you are part of that completion. You always were. And the silence of the clay is not absence, but presence, not emptiness, but potential, not the end of the song, but the pause before the next verse begins. And the verse is yours to sing, and kingship is yours to channel, and heaven is yours to remember. And it begins now, here, with this breath, with this choice, with this moment of recognition that you are more than you seem. That time is not your prison, but your playground. That the gods did not abandon you, because you are them. And when kingship descended from heaven, it descended into you. And you've been carrying it all along, waiting to remember. And now perhaps you do.